Greetings, folks. Welcome back to A City Full of History. My name is Dan Thurber. I am your urban yarn spinner, and today we are in Soho. We're here to talk about everything from art to entertainment to steamships to exploration. It's a real mixed bag today, folks. And we're doing it all through the lens of this place. That right there. All right, well, that's a Prada store. That's not what we're discussing today. I am woefully unequipped to discuss Prada on the internet. But whereas today people come here to the northeast corner of Prince and Mercer Streets just across from Broadway looking for haute couture, for 4 years, from 1838 to 1842, they came here looking to travel the globe, everywhere from the Temple of Karnak in Egypt to Lima, Peru, Niagara Falls to Rome, and everything in between, following in the footsteps of one of the most intrepid explorers that New York City had ever seen. Today, on A City Full of History, we pay a visit to Frederick Catherwood's Panorama.
We're getting out of the library and onto the street. It really is a city full of history. You just have to go out and find it.
Frederick Catherwood was born on February 27, 1799, in Hoxton Parish in London. His family was firmly middle class, and young Frederick received a solid education. When he was 15, he was apprenticed to a London architect named Michael Meredith, and he would serve under Meredith for 6 years. When he was 21, feeling he had learned all he could from Meredith, he followed some friends to Rome, and there fell in love with antiquity. He would spend the next 13 years touring around the Mediterranean, everywhere from Rome to Greece to Egypt to the Middle East. He would return to London in 1834, his bags packed with etchings and drawings and watercolors of the antiquities he had been studying for over a decade. Once he got back to London, he was contacted by a man named Robert Buford, a painter, who was looking for new material for a panorama in Leicester Square, and he felt Catherwood might just be able to help him out.
By 1834, the panorama, or cyclorama as they're sometimes called, was not a new concept to Londoners. The idea of a massive, up to 360-degree painting was first developed in the 1780s by Irish painter Robert Barker. Barker's design was to mount his large panoramic canvases in a specially designed building, lit by skylight, with a viewing platform in the center. In 1793, Barker leased a piece of property in Leicester Square and built his rotunda. It was an instant success, and the panorama would become one of the most popular entertainments of the early 19th century.
When Barker passed away in 1806, his son, Henry Ashton Barker, took control of the rotunda. Henry Ashton was a very talented painter in his own right, having assisted his father with several of his panoramas, as well as painted a few of his own. Henry Ashton Barker would sell his interest in the rotunda to his one-time assistant, Robert Buford. Now, Buford had traveled extensively and would paint panoramas drawing on his own experiences. But by 1834, he was looking for new material. He kept an eye out for British artists returning from travels abroad, and that search led him to Frederick Catherwood.
Buford painted a view of Jerusalem from drawings Catherwood had done, and Catherwood gave lectures to patrons. Their partnership lasted almost 2 years, when in 1836, Catherwood came to New York. His reasons for doing so are not known. He appears to have still been on amicable terms with Buford. For Catherwood, it may have been as simple as wanderlust, and a desire to make his name.
Now, by the time Catherwood arrived in New York City in 1836, the idea of the panorama was already known to New Yorkers. The first one to cross the pond did so in 1795. It was done by a man named John Winstanley, and it was basically just a copy of Robert Baker's view of London. In 1819, right here on this very spot in New York's City Hall Park at the northeast corner, a rotunda was opened by a man named John Vanderlyn, a local portrait painter, for the express purpose of exhibiting his panorama entitled A Panoramic View of the Palace and Gardens of Versailles. The rotunda was short-lived. Van der Linde lacked the charisma and showmanship to really carry something like a panorama to success in those days, and the show closed. But, interestingly enough, the painting is a rare example of a panorama that survives to the present day. New Yorkers can still view the Panorama of Versailles a few blocks north at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When Catherwood first arrived in New York City, he hung out his shingle as an architect again, although he was clearly looking for something more. You see, before he left London, he purchased the View of Jerusalem panoramic canvas from Robert Buford, with hopes of replicating its success here in the States. Partnering with a bookseller named George W. Jackson, Catherwood rented a piece of property at the corner of Prince and Mercer Streets, just across Broadway from Niblo's Garden, a popular theater and entertainment palace. For the next 4 years, from 1838 to 1842, Catherwood would display several panoramas, some based on his drawings, others not, including the View of Jerusalem, New Zealand's Bay of Islands, the Temple of Karnak at Thebes, views of Niagara Falls, and many more. A quarter would get you admission into Mr. Catherwood's panorama, and another 12.5 cents would get you an explanatory booklet, which would contain historical context of the site you were seeing, as well as a detailed map and legend explaining each of the individual sites around the panorama.
The Catherwood Panorama, also called the Catherwood Rotunda, proved very successful. Catherwood had learned a lot from Buford and the Barkers and knew that engaging the public was the key to success. His staff provided explanations of the sites depicted at regular times throughout the day, with Catherwood himself giving lectures daily when he was in New York. In 1839, and again in 1841, Catherwood left New York on the adventures that would make his legacy. Traveling alongside his friend, John Lloyd Stephens, the two journeyed to Central America, Stephens seeking to write about the native peoples of the area, and Catherwood to make detailed drawings and surveys of the scenery and ruins. The two books Stephens wrote about their expeditions, Incidents of Travel in Central America and Incidents of Travel in Yucatan, would be incredibly popular, and for the first time would bring accurate and detailed information about the Maya to the attention of the Western world. Both books were profusely illustrated by gorgeous and detailed engravings from Catherwood's meticulous drawings and surveys.
In 1842, tragedy would strike Catherwood. On the evening of July 29th, shortly after closing up the rotunda for the night, a fire broke out and burned the building to the ground. Inside was the Jerusalem canvas, as well as a massive, massive collection of Catherwood's original drawings and watercolors and writings and journals, and a collection of all the artifacts that he had brought back with him from his travels in Yucatan. Witnesses say that the rotunda had been struck by lightning, and that's what caused the fire. Other witnesses discount this. It is worth noting probably, though, that while Robert Barker's London panorama was lit by a skylight, Catherwood, in all of his advertisements for his own New York rotunda, said that his panoramas would be lit by over 200 gas lights. A novelty for the time, perhaps, but also a possible fire hazard. The fire hit Catherwood pretty hard. His loss was estimated at upwards of $30,000, of which only a small portion was actually insured. And following the blaze, he went back to business and architecture. He returned to London, and from there was sent to British Guiana, where he supervised the building of a railroad there. He developed malaria in British Guiana and then went to California to recover. There he found work surveying the first railroad in that state, as well as purchasing some property. He returned to London from there to wrap up his affairs and superintend the editing of a new edition of Incidents of Travel in Central America in memory of his friend John Lloyd Stephens, who had passed away in 1852.
When all this was done, he began the trip back to California, boarding a steamer, the SS Arctic, bound first for New York. On September 27, 1854, while nearing Cape Race, Newfoundland, the Arctic collided with the Vesta, a French vessel. In one of the worst maritime disasters of the day, well over 300 people drowned, with only 88 survivors. After weeks of waiting and hoping, as the death toll climbed higher and higher, the newspapers finally published a single sentence. Mr. Catherwood, the distinguished artist who accompanied Mr. Stevens on his tour to Central America, was lost also.
For all of his contributions, Frederick Catherwood is largely in the shadow of history. Most of what was written about him was produced before the rise of digitized records and the advent of the internet. Through the use of digitized immigration records, I believe I can add just a little bit back into the record of Frederick Catherwood. See, most of what's written about him mentions that he had a wife and child, but no further information was known about them. But by going through immigration records, I believe that his wife's name was Gertrude. She was British, born about 1813. His son's name was Frederick, born 1834, and his daughter was Anna, born in 1836, shortly after they arrived in New York City. It's a small contribution perhaps, but I hope that by giving more detail and more information about the man's personal connections, I can add a little bit more flesh and blood to a historical figure who would otherwise remain that much more obscure. Frederick Catherwood created a ridiculous amount of artwork about his travels, almost all of which was lost in the Rotunda fire or just generally lost to history. His primary biographer, Victor Wolfgang von Hagen, described his search for information about Mr. Catherwood as if a spiteful poltergeist had followed in his wake, destroying every page of his life's testimony. Today, this block between Broadway, Prince, and Mercer Streets contains no trace of the fantastic amusements that once occupied it. But if you stop for just a moment amid the hustle and bustle of modern-day New York City and cast your mind back to 1838, you can almost hear the sound of a tinny piano and the smell of beer wafting out of Niblo's garden as entertainment-hungry New Yorkers cross a cobblestoned Broadway and give a quarter to Mr. Catherwood to be taken on a journey across the globe. For Bookworm History, I'm Dan Thurber. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for stopping by.